everyone, and welcome to Government 340. Today we're continuing our topic from earlier this week, looking at Islam in Central Asia, but specifically today focusing on the role of radical Islam in Central Asia. And so, as we discussed on Tuesday, religion is very much viewed as a threat to the state in Central Asia, where legibility is a crucial concern, and religion is often a site of illegibility, where practices can very easily be obscured or hidden or made difficult to read by the state. So the state has an interest in monitoring developments in this sphere and policing them. And with the subject of radical Islam, the state needs to be able to tell who has been radicalized, because radicalized individuals, more so than religion, are a direct threat to the state. And this often leads to the secularization of practices. So conservative Islamic practices or even traditional practices are secularized. And we can see this with regards to practices that repress women, for example. So the state has come out against practices such as polygamy, underage marriage, or even bride prices. And the state wants to discourage these traditions and so bans them. But rather than just getting rid of them in their entirety, the state creates a secular justification for why some practices continue to exist. For example, couples who are going to be marrying in some Central Asian states need to go through a medical exam prior to being able to get married. And a benefit of this is that it means that they're aware of any potential genetic diseases that they're carriers for. But a negative side of this is that making it a prerequisite for marriage carries worrying parallels to eugenics. And it's not really used in practice to actually check whether or not people are healthy or not. It's meant to make sure that the bride is still a virgin, which is a religious practice that now has been given a secular justification, so the practice can carry on and have state approval. Despite being stripped of its religious meaning, it still serves a purpose of the religious community. And while it's still policing women and women's bodies, despite claiming that religion has been taken out of it, the state hyper-focuses on the role of women and specifically mothers. So the state prescribes them with a leading role in preventing the radicalization of young men, specifically their sons. And they're also meant to teach their children how to be good citizens and what the state deems to be good Muslims. And it still assigns women the leading role in taking care of the family, despite the fact that many women are working outside the home, and despite placing no such obligation on the father. Additionally, there's still dress restrictions for women. So the Tajik government does not want women wearing what are seen as traditional Arab fashions, but they cannot dress in overly Western fashions either, because these are deemed too provocative. And once again, it's placing the onus for men's behavior on women. And much like the Soviet deveiling campaign, this once again strips women of a lot of their bodily autonomy. And women's behavior is still heavily policed both by the national government and by local organizations that use shame to shape behavior. And while Islamic practices are more open than they were in the past, the policies pursued by the state make the practice of Islam highly contradictory in a lot of Central Asian states. Because the state has insisted that it is secular while continuing to incorporate elements of Islam when it supports the legitimization of the state. And it still focuses on targeting and preventing radicalization. And this focus creates intolerance, which is then used as a tool for state repression. So once again, much like the Soviet era, where increasing the monetarization led to implications of disloyalty, which led to greater repression, which led to greater instances of disloyalty and more repression, and so on ad nauseum, we see a similar process happening here, where religion is a highly securitized issue, which makes all forms of what the state deems to be improper religious practices equivalent to being radical and or terrorist, in order to both repress religious elements and also to repress potential political opponents by claiming that they are forwarding radical ideas. And people can have a variety of responses to state policies. So some in Central Asia support these policies pursued by the state. So they recognize that what the state is doing may be a violation of human rights, but they view these policies as necessary to create order, and that these policies are better than disorder or terrorism. And most importantly for this view, the state is not believed to be strong enough to contain radical elements if they were to go unchecked and garner support. So stamping out any potential radical group is very important to do when it's in its earliest stages, because after that point, the state may prove incapable of doing so because it lacks the capacity. A second response is acquiescence. So this is often passive support, and it is the most common response among individuals in Central Asia. And this can actually be beneficial to the state because it means that the population is largely uninvolved. And really, to have successful policies, they really only need a small cadre of loyal and involved individuals. And the passivity of the majority of the population serves their interest in that they're largely depoliticized and not interested in following the issues. And as long as they continue to have tacit support for the actions of the state, they can pursue their motives unchecked. Also associated with this position is the idea that the state knows what is best. So there is a high tendency towards paternalistic politics in a lot of Central Asian states. And actual support or tacit support of these policies can vary over time, but there is a perception that, like the father rules the family, the president is the father of the population. And this means that the state can pursue these policies, although it has not been wholly successful in creating docile citizens. So when you're in this acquiescence category, you can move from acquiescence to resistance if the state acts too harshly one way or another. A third reaction is resistance, which is much more risky than support or acquiescent in that it is also an active position against the state, whereas acquiescence is passive. But it comes in both public and private forms, so it's not a unified resistance in most cases. There are incentives to hide or obscure individuals' real preferences under authoritarian regimes. So there is a movement of practices that are against the state's wishes to the home, much like in the Soviet period. And we also see this idea of malicious compliance. So complying with the state's issued policies in such a way that it actually harms the state in some ways or reduces efficiency or productivity. So one common regulation is that women who are attending educational institutions cannot wear hijabs. And individuals may choose to still send their children to a public school to be educated, and they may have their daughter not wear a hijab in class, but immediately after leaving the school building, they're supposed to put one on. So while the state is trying to promote a certain policy with regards to wearing a hijab, individuals are not necessarily complying with that regulation anywhere except for where it is explicitly mandated. Additionally, not all resistance comes in the form of radicalization. So there are human rights and legalistic arguments against what the state is doing, where the government actions are illegal and a violation of human rights, where oftentimes what they're doing to repress individuals is not something that the state has the right to do according to these countries' constitutions, and represents a violation of the protections that the state has laid out for individuals. We also see philosophical arguments that instead of focusing on legalistic arguments, instead focus on how the state has too harshly defined what is right and wrong. So their insistence on black and white definitions is particularly harmful and misrepresents society, creating a very narrow view of religion and what is proper in society. And that this view of what is right is used to target individuals. We also see theological arguments, which focus on the fact that the government policies restricting the practice of Islam are against the teachings of Islam itself. And due to state policies towards Islam and the restrictions of practice, you might assume that the state doesn't really care about such arguments. But a lot of the states in Central Asia still do derive a degree of their legitimacy from the fact that they are representatives of an Islamic people. And because of this, it can actually have an effect on the state because it's using Islam to legitimize its rule. And if how it's exercising Islam goes against the teachings of Islam, that creates a contradiction in the state's own foundational myths. In addition to the population's response to the state's securitization of Islam, we also see several perceptions and misperceptions about radicalization, specifically misperceptions about the radicalization of the populations in Central Asia. So the response of the state has been largely disproportionate. We see highly securitized state apparatuses and borders and communities within Central Asia. But the record shows that radicalization and religious militancy in Central Asia is incredibly rare. And while we have seen Islamic groups and parties, they have not necessarily been radicalized. The Islamic Resistance Party of Tajikistan, for instance, while the government claimed that it was radical, it mobilized initially during a civil war and was a long-standing legitimate Tajik political party. And while it was banned for being radical, it was more likely banned because it was an opposition party. And the state often uses this to target Islamic parties in that they are radical if they oppose the state's interests. And this has led to a lack of parties that are specifically founded on religious grounds in Central Asia because it's so easy for the state to target those groups on the basis of this securitized framework. And this securitization has actually harmed the Central Asian states. So the securitization of borders, for instance, is meant explicitly to prevent militarized groups from crossing borders. But this has vastly reduced the economic opportunities for actors in Central Asia. And while there is a possibility that we may have seen more radical Islamic groups if it wasn't as securitized, there is no evidence to suggest that this would be the case. In fact, the fact that it is so securitized means that a lot of non-radicalized groups have gone underground in order to resist persecution, when if they hadn't been pushed to do so, they would be practicing openly. The international community also plays an outsized role in perceptions of Islam in Central Asia. So the terrorist organizations in the Middle East, things like the Iraq and Afghan wars, the global war on terror, the Syrian and Libyan civil wars have all influenced how Central Asian states view Islam, which is particularly interesting given that it has a long-standing historical tradition of being the majority religion in Central Asia. The state is very wary of any major Islamic interests and highly restricts the practice of it out of fears that elements could reflect what are happening in other regions of the world and result in the destabilization of the state. And with this comes the assumption that Islam is violent and destabilizing. And these assumptions drive government policies that are both harmful and restrictive to individuals that are living in Central Asia. And alongside these misperceptions, we also see several claims about Islamization and radicalization. And part of this is that the Islamization of society in Central Asia is a break with the Soviet past. But as we've discussed, this revival is not so much a revival as it is the moving of private practices back into the public sphere. But this is used as a boogeyman by states in Central Asia, where the revival is assumed to mean radicalization. But there really are not clear divides with the Soviet past, and there has been a steady transition of practices back into the public space, but the states in Central Asia have largely maintained their secular nature. Additionally, there's an assumption that to Islamize means that you are radicalizing. But there's no reason to equate turning to Islam for political or moral reasons with political extremism. The two are very different. And this very much falls into a sliding slope logical fallacy. And when opposing the state, people often do turn to religious organizations, but they may do so because of explicitly religious grounds, but they may also do so because, on a whole, religious organizations tend to be more organized than other forms of social cooperation. And part of this is that religion serves as a common institution that enables a more ready pursuit of collective action and produces a baseline of trust between individuals within a group that enables them to pursue goals and prevent free riding, much like we talked about with informal institutions. This is a means to promote collective action by providing an organizational framework that may not necessarily exist in other cases, or in other cases, they have to build up this kind of organization from the ground up, whereas religious institutions already have a pre-existing framework to build upon when they are mobilizing. There's also an assumption that authoritarianism and poverty lead to radicalization. But more commonly, as a result of both authoritarianism and poverty, resignation is the more common response than radicalization. So much like when we were talking about reactions to government policies, acquiescence is the common response. So people, in a lot of cases, are incredibly passive to situations they don't believe that they can change. And one of the real social problems in Central Asia is alcoholism. And this is where a lot of people who are in situations of intense poverty turn to, is to social vices like drinking and drug use. But these are not given sufficient attention because they are not securitized in the same way. So while drug use might receive securitization, it's not securitized in a way that gets people who are addicted to drugs any sort of help. It gets them prosecuted as part of the drug war and drug trade that goes on in Central Asia. And so the state's focus on securitization actually causes them to ignore other potential social ills that would be a better location for government funds to go to. Additionally, what we've seen in response to poverty is massive labor migration, and this has been mostly of young men. But young men are also the most likely group to join a militia or radical organization. Largely just statistically, they are more likely to be engaged in violence than any other demographic. And this can undercut the traditional relationship that we see between poverty and violence against the state, in that those who are extremely poor and would be the most likely to commit acts of violence are no longer in Central Asian states. But because they're not there and building an economic foundation within Central Asia, it's also perpetuating this cycle of the flight of the labor force into other countries. Additionally, when looking specifically at authoritarianism, the country in Central Asia that is the most authoritarianism is Turkmenistan, which has not seen widespread rebellion or jihadist violence. And historically, weak government has resulted in violence, and it hasn't necessarily been related to regime. We can see the outbreak of violence both in democratic and authoritarian regimes, and perhaps even the radicalization of elements in either type. It depends on the capacity of the regime to combat that radicalization once it starts to gain steam, whereas regimes in Central Asia like Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan lack the capacity to prevent the outbreak of violence. Now, the violence is not necessarily that of radicalized groups, and certainly not of radicalized Islamic groups, but weak governance does contribute to instability writ large, both of the regime and of society, and can contribute to the outbreak of violence, which then perpetuates state weakness. Along with claims about Islamization and radicalization, we also have claims about Muslim groups and political Islam. And the first two really go hand in hand, and this is that underground Muslim groups are both extremist and radical by nature, and they're also globally networked. So this is where we really see the perceptions of the international community play a large role in assumptions. So underground groups are perceived to be more radical than those that would operate above ground. And the idea is that groups that are not radical shouldn't have to operate underground. But due to restrictive state policies about what are approved practices, some Muslim groups have gone underground not because they are extremist or radical, but because the state objects to the way that they practice Islam. And these groups may not become extremist or radical. There's no guarantee that they will do so, or even a certainty or a likelihood that they will do so. It's really the state policies that are driving them to do so. And if the state was less restrictive, you would see these groups operate above ground. And this is largely a way to avoid persecution and violence from the state rather than a way to plot violence against the state or civilians. Additionally, groups in Central Asia tend to be isolated from global networks. So elements may be connected, but overwhelmingly, the Islamic tradition in Central Asia is separate from that in the Middle East and North Africa. And the assumption that they're globally networked is used to crack down on movements without looking into the specifics. And what they mean by global network is not a connection of Islamic institutions. What that's code for is essentially Al-Qaeda and other similar organizations. And from what we've seen coming out of Central Asia, most groups, when they do exist, do not have connections to groups like Al-Qaeda. There's also an assumption that political Islam opposes the state, but this ignores the reality in Central Asia. So oftentimes, elites in Central Asia do not share power outside of their business or political networks. So this is very much the clientelistic nature of politics, and this occurs even with Islamic elite. And what we see more often than not is that state elites are fighting with other elites over control for the state, not a particular group fighting to overthrow the state. So rather than the overthrow of any particular government or the usurpation of the state, a group of elites is fighting with another group of elites to capture the state apparatus. When we talked about the Tulip Revolution, for instance, this wasn't specifically about Islam, but we saw the regional elites being the main driver for mobilization, rather than this being a popular uprising or a democratic upswell. It was very much still those elite networks fueling competition over the regime. And we see this with Islamic parties as well. So most of the Islamic parties in Tajikistan were also southern regional parties. So they were mainly concentrated in the south. And this reflects the divisions that occurred when those groups first mobilized during the Civil War, is that was a north-south conflict. And religious issues were overlaid over a religious divide, over the rulership of the state. Also, as we saw in Tuesday's readings, people who are practicing Muslims or subscribe to an Islamic moral code often also prefer the continued existence of a secular state. So we need to critically examine why these assumptions are so common and so prevalent, both in Central Asia and for the international community looking at the Central Asian states. So there are a lot of assumptions and perceptions that are held both by the governments and individuals in Central Asia about the possibility of the radicalization of certain groups and this presumed ease of radicalization. And international actors and viewers sometimes look at Central Asia and, when not critically examining these structures or why they're pursued by states, can assume that what the government is promoting as the slippery slope of radicalization is inevitable in Central Asia. And this runs directly counter to a lot of the empirics, where we just don't have records or indications that this is anywhere close to the actual situation of Islam, both that being practiced and of political Islam in Central Asia. So what we've been talking about so far has mostly been focused on how the state assumes that radicalization is too easy, that there is this hyper-focus on securitization and an assumption that individuals will radicalize if they are practitioners of certain brands and expressions of Islam. And while this is not the case, it does not mean that there have been no instances of radicalization of individuals from Central Asia. There are individuals who have engaged in such attacks abroad. There have been isolated incidents within Central Asia. The problem is much less than it is often described to be, but it still exists. So looking specifically at Uzbek radicalization, so between 2016 and 2018, there were 4 terror attacks conducted by ethnic Uzbek individuals, one in New York, one in Stockholm, and 2 in Turkey. As another example, the Boston Marathon bombings that took place in 2013 and killed 3 individuals were conducted by 2 Kyrgyz American brothers of Chechen descent. So once again, you see some elements emerging from the region of Central Asia, although compared to other regions, terrorism has been a strategy used less often by groups, both within Central Asia and abroad. So on one hand, some assume that these individuals might be radicalized abroad, so it's the influence of the global Islamic network, and they're radicalized due to a lack of acceptance in whatever country that they move to. So theoretically, they would not have been radical in their home state, but they're radicalized away from that home, kind of in the worst version of culture shock imaginable, where individuals who are separated from their homeland and their culture respond to that separation with violence, or that separation makes them more vulnerable to groups intent on radicalizing them, where those groups provide what they view to be their safe haven and then lead them to pursue violent acts. This has a particular detriment to American policies such as vetting, because this means that vetting incoming migrants would not be effective, since when they are incoming, they would not be radicalized, but they would only become radical after living in the United States for a certain amount of time. On the other hand, some view radicalization to be cultural in some way, that there is a cultural element to radicalization. There's something about where they come from that drives radicalization, that the religiousness in their home state means that people are, for some reason, easier to manipulate into pursuing violent and terrorist acts. This is somewhat odd, though, because a lot of the assumptions are that due to restrictions on religious expression in their home states, particularly as it relates to Central Asia, would drive these people abroad to conduct acts of terror. But this doesn't make a lot of sense when it would be easier for them to target their own government to force a change to allowing them to express religion as they view to be the proper form of Islam. And it might be something about the West and the interference of the West that drives them out to attack targets in Europe or the United States. But this is another location where we see the differing history versus the Middle East and Central Asia really come to the fore, where the site of a lot of anger regarding outside influence may not come from the actions of the United States in Central Asia, but instead comes from anger towards the Russian Federation. But again, we don't see much explicitly coming from communities in Central Asia. We do see terror attacks in Russia from Chechen communities, or at the very least, they're the government's favorite scapegoat for anything that happens. Although they are definitely a location that fields groups that do conduct acts of terror within Russia. We don't see that happening to the same degree in Central Asia, largely probably because they gained their independence in 1991, whereas Chechnya did not. But once again, there's no real empirics to back up either the international influence or cultural component arguments. And some fall back on these cultural elements as a particularly weak and non-empirical founded belief to basically push forward ideas of racism and prejudice that allow them to forward those narratives sans actual evidence of these things forwarding acts of terror. An additional problem for groups in Central Asia is they're not homogenous. So a lot of what we see with the terror acts that happen abroad from Central Asia is that they're lone wolves, as they're called. So they're lone actors who engage in this. They usually don't have affiliations with larger Islamic terror organizations. So this might be something about their individual situation rather than either something about people who come from a particular country or something about a particular country's culture. Additionally, within Central Asia, we see diverse groups with varied membership, and some groups might have a radical arm in an otherwise moderate group, or they have splinter elements. So the groups that we see operating in Central Asia are not necessarily Islamic, they're not necessarily radical. They might contain individuals that are one or the other, but that's not necessarily the case for the group as a whole. When we look at Tajikistan, for instance, as one of the major countries that had an Islamic party for a time, the Islamic Resistance Party of Tajikistan was one group of many that mobilized in the Tajik opposition during their civil war. So it was not that one side of that civil war was Islamic, it was just that one particular subgroup within the larger opposition force was an Islamic party. Now, that diversity and that heterogeneous nature of these groups means that they are much less efficient at organizing and having success. So the opposition forces in the Tajik Civil War lost to the more unified northern forces. And this is a pattern that we see quite often, where we do see a large number of heterogeneous groups forming and maybe engaging in some actions, but they are typically shorter-lived than groups that are more homogenous on ethnic, linguistic, or religious grounds, because it's easier for homogenous groups to pursue collective action, whereas in the long term, heterogeneous groups tend to fragment along those lines, which prevents these groups from gaining much power in Central Asia. We also see potential intervening variables with this relationship between culture, either of the home state or of a foreign state, and radicalization. The first being ethnicity. So we see in Central Asia that your ethnic group, more so than your religiosity, is a better predictor of whether or not you would support violence in support of religion, which is interesting that there is a difference along religious grounds between groups within Central Asia, and suggests that this might be the line on which people identify more, rather than their perceptions on whether or not violence can legitimately be used in defense of religion, despite the fact that the question is asking specifically about religion, that ethnicity is the better predictor. And this means that in Central Asia, ethnicity and ethnic groups may be more mobilized than religion. So a lot of people share the same version of Islam, even if there are differences in how they practice or what the state promotes as practice. There will be more distinct divisions along ethnicity because there are actual different ethnic groups, whereas the majority of practitioners of Islam in Central Asia are Hanafi Sunni. Additionally, as we saw in Eric McGlinchey's piece, there is a lot of evidence to support that past exposure to conflict is the best predictor of whether or not you would support violence in defense of religion. And this would indicate that exposure to violence raises your tolerance for violent acts and makes it a more likely response to future situations. And looking at whether or not violence is justified in Central Asia, if they don't think that conflict is a problem, 83.7% of respondents indicated that it was never justified, whereas only 61.7% of those who did see conflict as a problem indicated that it was never justified. 18.5% of those who thought conflict was a problem said that it was rarely justified, and 11.7% thought that it would be sometimes justified, and 2.1% said it was often justified. And all of these numbers on it being rarely, sometimes, and often justified, so violence is rarely, sometimes, or often justified in defense of religion, were higher than that of those that said that conflict was not a problem. So if they thought that conflict was a problem in the state, they would be more likely to think that violence and additional conflict were an acceptable response in defense of religion. And this indicates that there is a cycle of conflict that we see in Central Asia, rather than it either being a cultural or international influence on radicalization. When people are engaged in civil wars, in riots, in violence, in ethnic or religious violence, this shapes their perceptions later on and makes some people more prone to violence. So in conclusion, looking at radical Islam in Central Asia, we see a lot of incorrect assumptions about the degree of radicalization and the nature of various groups that are present in Central Asia. And much like we discussed on Tuesday, the state plays an incredibly large role in policing and monitoring different organizations, and has a hyper focus on the securitization of this issue and on preventing what it views to be any radical elements. And there is a lot of complexity in the practice of religion, much as we discussed on Tuesday. And much like how the production of legibility oversimplifies things, so do these securitizing policies with regards to Islam. And the state plays a very large role in both the repression of certain religious practices and of perpetuating these misperceptions with the nature of how groups become radicalized or which groups are radicalized. And it's often used as a means for state consolidation and state control rather than to actually prevent any radicalization. And there's also a difference between radicalization and politicization. So radicalization contains necessarily an element of violence, either against the state or against civilians in the pursuit of political goals, whereas there can be political Islamic parties. And these groups can be active without any violent component. But the state treats political Islam and radical Islam in Central Asia largely the same. And this has led to a largely unnecessary degree of securitization and policing of religious practices. That while it presently has a degree of passive support from the population, this adverse to the state's wishes might eventually lead to a degree of radicalization as the political expression of Islam continues to be repressed. And while the repression of Islam or political Islam may not necessarily become radicalized, the state treatment of it may eventually produce radicalization or violence as the only avenue for the expression of the political will of those groups. And this is not because radicalization is inherent, but because the state is closing off non-violent means of expressing preferences of the population, where increasing constriction of the public sphere can lead to violence. And this doesn't necessarily have to be on the basis of religion, though religion is one of the more common targets of the regime. It can be on ethnic, it can be on linguistic, it can be on clan lines. But we don't see the state being able to repress clan identities or restrict lineage political operation in the same way that they have been in the past able to restrict the public expression of religion. But overall, the threat of radicalization has been vastly overblown in Central Asia, at least as things presently stand. And the fact that it has been so overblown has been used as a vehicle for the state to continue to consolidate authoritarian power bases and to forward their own political goals. And on that note, I'll leave you guys off for today. I look forward to hearing your thoughts on Thursday.